a couple of really important things for me to do here. One, of course, is to accurately and fully capture the history, accurately and as fully as possible, capture what happened when those young ministers tried to go to the Pickerick and got repelled with axe handles and pistols, and to capture what happened when they tried to get beds at the Heart of Atlanta Motel and were turned away. But I also felt it was important to try to fully understand all the key players on all sides of this issue, understand their background, their motivations, and sort of what led them to where they were. So that included, Maddox had written his own book. There have been books written about Maddox. I read all of those. I watched video, archived digital video of the key players, see how they acted. I looked up what they said in court, what some of their statements were, to really understand their backgrounds, their backdrops, and their motivations. And the same applies for the ministry students who all then went on to become ministers in their various hometowns. Understand what were their motivations. So I think that makes a book like this, a fuller story. You don't shy away for a second from clearly what were some racist acts, but you also try to put the figures, the city, the times in their historical perspective, in their full perspective. I think it makes for a fuller book. So thank you. The Civil Rights Bill had 11 components, and it was, I think many people will tell you, the most significant Civil Rights Act ever passed at that point in the United States. I focused on Title II, which was public accommodations. Public accommodations just means hotels, restaurants, movie houses that may be privately owned, but basically are open to the public. We're not talking about a private swimming pool or something. And what Congress did was a little interesting. I won't get too far afield on this, but Congress used the Commerce Clause as a way to pass this law. What they said was, if you are an ostensibly private business, but you're open to the public, you are subject to the Commerce Clause and you are subject to Civil Rights Act of 1964. What that meant was, if you were a hotel or restaurant, say in Atlanta, as these were, and you took customers from out of state, or you got goods and services from out of state, you fell under the act. So that question was later tested by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ratified it as being a fully sound case. And what happened here was, in Atlanta, you had Lester Maddox, who built his own restaurant at Pickerick and operated it for 17 years, I think, by the time the Civil Rights Act was passed. And you had Morton Rolliston, the proprietor and main operator of the Heart of Atlanta Motel. Both of them were very firm in their opinions. They might have come from, and they did come from, deeply different backgrounds, completely different backgrounds, but they shared common views about segregation, integration. And they shared common views about the government telling them what to do. Both of them said, the federal government doesn't get to tell me who I serve at my restaurant. Federal government doesn't get to tell me who I allow in my motel. Both of them, and both their places of business, while each employed Black employees, neither of them allowed Black customers. Maddox would not allow Black customers, nor would Maddox allow white customers if he found out they were integrationists. Maddox would not allow those in his restaurant, which was very busy, except for Black customers. Morton Rolliston only allowed white customers into his fancy Heart of Atlanta motel. He would not allow others. So when Congress passed, and then President Lyndon Johnson in July of 1964 signed this Civil Rights Act into law, both proprietors were ready. In fact, Morton Rolliston, unbeknownst to the federal government, was busy working on a lawsuit that he filed the same day that the law was passed. He filed it at night. He drove to the clerk's office, knocked on the clerk's door. There's a rule at that time, probably still in place, that says federal clerks must be available 24 hours of business. So Morton Rolliston docketed his lawsuit against the federal government that night, saying, you cannot tell me what to do. He would later argue that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 violated his 13th Amendment right, essentially saying, you are telling me I can't operate that I want to operate. That was an argument that, of course, he lost significantly. And then the very next night, after he filed the suit, 3 of the 5 main ministry students tried to go to the Pickerick. They said to themselves, look, we have the law behind us. The president says we can do this. We're going to go to the Pickerick restaurant, get dinner. Maddox was waiting for them with a pistol, which he put in the face of one of the young ministers. He had axe handles. His customers had axe handles. They drove them off to Pickerick. And in fact, before they left, Maddox bashed their car with his axe handle. one thing that struck me was really the bravery of these young ministry students. This was at a period in the US where civil rights killings were not unique, were not unusual, and they were very graphic and very horrible. They were happening all over the South. These ministry students were threatened with a gun and an axe handle that first night. They kept going back and back and back, persistently going back, employing Martin Luther King's vision of nonviolent social justice. So they would keep going back. They wouldn't fight, but they would go back and with their words and with the law would seek a seat at the table, which I thought was fairly compelling. The Supreme Court was so motivated to address these issues that they took up oral arguments on a week that was normally a ceremonial week, where they didn't do any work. And they moved rapidly and voted ultimately 9-0 to say the Civil Rights Act of 1964 fully passes legal muster, and that what Congress had done and what the president had signed is legal and stands to this day. No, it's a fascinating story on so many fronts and really shows the struggle. It wasn't the end of the story for Lester Maddox in particular. So I'll take these one by one. Morton Rolston, who brought his lawsuit against the federal government and its president in the Justice Department, he would not allow Black customers into his motel, but he said, and he said in court, he said, if you ultimately rule against me, I will open my doors. Ultimately, after the ruling came, he opened his doors. In fact, I interviewed Mr. Rolston's son, who worked as a part-time clerk at the motel back then. And he said, after the Civil Rights Act 64 was affirmed by the US Supreme Court, busloads of customers, many Black customers came, and he viewed it as a victory for civil rights. Years later, the Heart of Atlanta closed. So once the law of the land was affirmed by the Supreme Court, Morton Rolston accepted the rule of law. Maddox didn't accept it. Even as Maddox lost every court hearing he fought over the young minister's lawsuit against him, he lost every case, he refused to budge. At one point, after the cases went to court, Maddox actually closed the Pickerick for a little while, then reopened it under a new name, Lester Maddox Cafeteria. And he opened it under a new name with new rules that basically said, I'm a local restaurant only. I don't serve out-of-state customers. I don't serve integrationists. Maddox was trying to circumvent the rule of the law by saying, I don't fall under the Commerce Clause. Of course, the ministers kept going back. He tried to violently repel them again. He lost that argument as well, as he lost every argument. He lost it completely, and ultimately, the federal court in Georgia imposed a sizable fine on him. So ultimately, Maddox did close down the Pickerick, but his story was not done. One of his acquaintances back then, because this fight had gotten so much attention in local media, one of his acquaintances back then said, Lester, this thing is going to make you governor. And I'll mention about that is Lester Maddox had become, as his restaurant was very popular in Atlanta, he had taken out full-page ads in the Atlanta Saturday papers, and his ads had the menu items in the bottom, but the whole bulk of the ads were his views on the laws of the day and his railing against integrators. He twice ran for mayor of Atlanta. He lost, and he blamed Martin Luther King and his supporters for his losses, because the Black vote was entirely against him. But when he was engaged in the Pickerick battle, his friend said to him, Lester, you could run for governor. This is going to help you. Ultimately, he did. And in a race in which he didn't get the most votes, he ended up taking seat as the governor of Georgia. And I think he did win support from pockets of Georgia at that point that were maybe not as progressive as Atlanta's hub was. And so for the ministers, they ultimately won this case in that their point, restaurants and motels are open to all races. That is in fact the truth. But they wanted to eat at his restaurant. They never got a chance to. And then some of them said, well, our pushing on Maddox helped raise his profile and helped lead him to the governor's mansion. That is correct. The Heart of Atlanta motel was a few years after this case was replaced by another motel, and it's gone. And then ultimately, Maddox closed the Pickerick, which was then called the Lester Maddox Cafeteria, but will always be remembered as the Pickerick. Some prior employees opened it as a restaurant that did allow all customers. Then later on, Georgia Tech bought the property, and now it's no longer a restaurant. It's now another building unrelated to a restaurant on the grounds of Georgia Tech. I think there were hundreds or thousands of sort of unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. some of those heroes sort of lost their lives in the struggle, as we know. And one thing that I took away from the research of this book is, if you read this book, I think you'll see, let's introduce you to 5 of the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, maybe, who did risk their lives, did put their bodies on the line in a quest for equality and fairness for all, and to this day remain unsung heroes. I think if someone dives into the story, I think they'll see the significance of the legal issues, but they'll also see sort of the significance of some of the personalities behind the story as well.